Okay, so it's 7:02, so I'm going to get started with introductions. And I'm going to introduce Barbara Richter first. And this is taken from either your website or online, so forgive me if there are any mistakes or mispronunciations. Books have been part of the life of Barbara Basbanes Richter, who is both a bibliophile and a francophile, and there was no way she could have grown up without an appreciation for the power of the printed word. After receiving both a BA and an MA in French literature from Smith College and Tufts University, respectively, she taught French and Latin for the better part of a decade. As the department chair of a world languages program in Fairfax County, Virginia, she led the development of a school-wide world language curriculum and resurrected a dying French and Latin program. She also has translated works from the French to English before, and her translations have appeared in the following books by nonfiction author Nicholas A. Basbanes: On Paper, Knopf, 2013, Every Book Its Reader, HarperCollins, November 2005, and Patience and Fortitude, HarperCollins, October 2001. In 2015, she translated 19th century French correspondence for Wedgstone Press, an endeavor funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, dedicated to transcribing and publishing the documents of Robert and Elizabeth Barrett Browning and their circle. In addition to translations, she interviews authors, illustrators, and other movers and shakers in the book world for Fine Books and Collections magazines and for Literary Features Syndicate. She has written about spy libraries, book arts programs for children, Alice in Wonderland's 150th birthday, Shakespeare on letterpress, even bibliotherapy, and how ISIS funds its terror programs by selling antiquarian books. She also wrote an essay about danger in children's literature for the spring 2015 issue of the Sewanee Review. Other publications include reviews and profiles for High Country News, Barishly.com, Faces Magazine, and FSR Magazine. And now I will introduce Nicholas A. Basbanes, who is the author of 10 critically acclaimed works of cultural history with a particular emphasis on various aspects of books and book culture. A Gentle Madness, Bibliophiles, Bibliomanes, and the Eternal Passion for Books, his first book, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction in 1995 and was a New York Times notable book. On Paper, The Everything of Its 2,000-Year History, 2013 Knopf, was one of 3 finalists for the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction and was named a Best Book of the Year by 7 major publications. In 2016, he was awarded a Public Scholar Research Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Humanities, his second NEH grant for work on Cross of Snow, A Life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, forthcoming, which is actually had come out. It came out in June of 2020, also from Knopf Publishers. He also writes the Gently Mad column for Fine Books and Collections magazines, lectures widely on book-related subjects, and is a frequent contributor to Humanities Magazine and other publications. And he lives in North Grafton, Massachusetts, and is joining us tonight from Massachusetts. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you for such a wonderful introduction.
You're welcome.
Barbara, you're going to start us off?
Sure. Well, I'm so happy to be here tonight with all of you, and thank you all for sharing your Monday nights with us on this beautiful May evening. And this is a first for my father and I get to hear him talking all the time about his projects, and I will spout off whenever I can about mine. So this is a pretty neat treat for the both of us to talk about our respective projects and what drew us to them and what we hope will draw you to them at some point, should you choose to read them, which of course we hope you do. I think what I'd like to do, I'll talk to you a little bit about the author of this book back here. So this is a book that I translated. You can see all of my notes in here. couple years ago, just kind of on a lark, I'd actually discovered this book, Mademoiselle de Malpeire, when I was in grad school. I was reading George Sand, who is a 19th century French woman author who wrote really big books like this. I mean, just gigantic. And we read Fanny Reybaud as a comparison. And I remember reading her and thinking that we needed more time with this wonderful woman and this wonderful work. And this was over a few years ago. And I have this bad habit of keeping all of my books, as as many of, I'm sure, of you in this group also keep your books. And I was looking for something to read one day, and I came upon my dog-eared paperback French copy, and I thought this would be a blast to translate. And it really was. As I hope we'll get to talk about a little bit, when I was translating it, what I found was so enjoyable about it was that the actual text was immensely readable, not only in French, but when I was translating it into English, it felt like it lent itself to a contemporary reading. It's active, it's quick, it's crisp, it's a little racy. So there was something kind of in there for everybody. One thing that I didn't know too much about was actually the author, Fanny Reybaud. Part of that is because a lot of her, the history of her and her family was lost in various moments in time. When she died in 1870, her son had predeceased her, her estranged husband had predeceased her. She was all alone. She had actually suffered from tuberculosis. I believe she had suffered from tuberculosis. It's not clear in the writings that remain what she had, but at one point she was coughing up blood in her youth, and it seems that these ailments stuck with her until she got older. So before she died, she did leave some of her writings to a niece who left Aix-en-Provence, which is where Fanny was from, and she was never heard from again, which is a shame. Because what does remain, the material that does remain of Fanny's life is so rich and fascinating. She was born in 1802 to a well-off family in Aix-en-Provence. Her father was a doctor. Her mother hailed from an aristocratic family. But Fanny's father and mother did not get along. And wouldn't you know it, Fanny's mother decided to file for divorce, which was unheard of, except for the brief moment in time during the French Revolution when you could do this. So Fanny and her brother were sent off to a convent. Well, Fanny was sent off to a convent, her brother went elsewhere. And at this convent, Fanny learned how to write, how to appreciate nature. She kept a daily journal, we're told, and she developed this appreciation for the written word, no doubt nurtured by the nuns who were there instructing her. Throughout this time, she grew, she became this beautiful woman. Beautiful, intelligent, well-read. Eventually, she leaves the convent. She goes back to her father's home, which, since her absence had turned into a sort of salon for the literati of Aix-en-Provence, which included François Mignet, who was a journalist and he was a historian. He wrote a multi-volume history of France, and Adolphe Thiers, who would actually become president of France during the Third Republic. So these sorts of people were mingling in Fanny's father's salon, and she mingled with them and she could hold her own. And what we understand is that she dazzled. It's a word that I think Dad will use for his Fanny, Fanny Appleton Longfellow. So far, Fanny Reybaud, she hasn't really written anything yet. At the time that she has left the convent and rejoined her father's house, she's about 18. And for a young, gorgeous, smart 18-year-old, you don't really want to be in Aix-en-Provence in the early 1800s. It's a little quiet. So she goes to Marseille, where, again, she takes charge of the circuit. She meets Charles Reybaud, who is a sugar plantation. They run sugar plantations, and they have factories in Marseille, and they fall in love. And it's this love at first sight, and it's a whirlwind marriage. They get married. It looks like they're going to have domestic bliss. They have a child, but then it turns out that Charles is something of a skirt chaser, and he can't quite put his bachelor ways behind him. And as much as Fanny protests, their fights get they get quite violent. She doesn't want things to end. She actually calls her mother to come help her at one point and asks for her advice, which is interesting because her own mother had left her father. And her mother, according to letters that exist today in a museum in Aix, her mother tried to convince her to stay in the marriage, but apparently became so overwhelming for Fanny that she left, and she went back to her father's house in about 1826. So she's now in 1820s, you actually couldn't divorce anymore because now you have the Napoleonic Code. And after the French Revolution, there was this, I guess, contraction for social and cultural values. So she couldn't actually obtain a divorce. She could be separated. But Charles still managed her life and actually sent his brother to keep an eye on her and their child, Emile. So she goes to her father's house. She gets what sounds like it's tuberculosis. She goes to recover in her mother's house in the country. And while she's there, she's convalescing. She's still keeping a journal, and she's starting to write again, but really for herself. Women writers during this period of the 1900s were, at least in terms of public publishing, you don't see too many. You have Fanny Reybaud here eventually, and you have George Sand. But Dad, I know when you're thinking about women writers, you can name a couple off the top of your head, right? And that's probably about it, because at least in France, women at this time were expected to be mothers and wives and protectors of the home and hearth. And so to write was a major leap. So she shared very little of this writing with anybody. She would take care of her child during the day, write at night, until eventually she started sharing her works with her friend Minier. And he said, you know, these are pretty good, but they could be better, as critics tend to be. He said, why don't you try and mimic Sir Walter Scott, the great Scottish novelist? So she did. She wrote a 600-page novel. And she actually published it, and it was a total disaster. It was, I think it sold maybe a couple hundred copies. And then she was not discouraged by this, and she actually wrote a second book, which was an equal failure, if I can say so. But what's wonderful about this woman is she didn't give up. She clearly had a desire to write and eventually to publish. Her breakout success came in 1831. She wrote a book translated into English called The Adventures of a Renegade under his dictation. So in theory, this woman is taking notes from a Spanish soldier who's come back from the war, and it's bundled up into this quick little novel. And that is Fanny's breakout success, which is followed by half dozen other novels in short order. All of a sudden, Fanny Reybaud is the star of the literary circuit. She's gone up to Paris, and she's meeting people like Balzac and Hans Christian Andersen, and she's writing regularly for literary reviews. And then she publishes Mademoiselle de Malepeire in 1854 and 1855 into, it was published in actually a journal called La Revue des Deux Mondes. And so it was in a serial. And this particular novel is the height of her powers. She's concise, she's crisp. She has a female protagonist whom you love to hate because she's gorgeous, and yet she's deceptive, and has everything all packaged in this 130-page book. And this is the book that puts Fanny on the international map. It's translated actually into English, into Arabic. Actually, it was one of the first books to be translated into Arabic in Syria by a publisher who was catering to a more literate or growing audience of women who wanted to read international works. So that's pretty neat. And it was reviewed around the world, even in the United States. And she kept right on writing. And then even after she got sick again later in life, her books were repackaged by Hachette, Louis Hachette. Hachette still exists today as a publisher. And he took Mademoiselle de Malpeire, a couple of others, and published them as these actually pretty flimsy paperbacks and sold them at train stations, but also alongside other great authors. So she was in very good company with her, I guess you could say, her back catalog. Then she gets sick and she stops writing anything new after the 1860s, and then she dies in 1870. Again, her family has disappeared. There's nobody there to really champion her literary legacy. So what happens? Her material disappears, and then people who know her work actually crib her, plagiarize her. There are examples. There was a gentleman by the name of Charles Reed in England in 1883 who took Mademoiselle de Malpeire, rechristened it as The Portrait, and called it his own. And his act was not called out until a year later by the Saturday Evening Review in 1884, which said they don't much care for Charles Reed's work. And even when he's plagiarizing, he's not doing a particularly good job. But there was something there. Clearly, he felt that there was something that people would want to read. So rather than give Fanny Reybaud credit, he took it as his own. The last major translation for this book was in 1905. Kind of fizzled. It got a little note in the New York Times that it was published and that it had been translated. But other than that, Fanny Reybaud is pretty much unknown, I would say, to all but a handful of people, simply because she's just not well known. And my hope is really that this book, at least in translation in the United States, will get people interested in her again. So that's kind of the short of Fanny's life. What makes this book so special? Part of it is the main characters. She's an aristocrat. She is supposed to marry another aristocrat, but she doesn't like him. She actually likes a man from the village. She reads banned books in secret, which is great if you're a bibliophile. And things kind of take a turn from there. What's most remarkable is that it's told from the point of view of a man. And the main character, Mademoiselle de Malpeire, hardly ever gets to speak. So if you're interested in how men and women interact, what do men notice, what do women notice, it's a pretty neat examination of, I guess, what men want. So that's the book itself. But Dad, I know if we can kind of get off the Mademoiselle de Malpeire a little bit, we could talk a little bit about women and education. And I know in Cross of Snow, your Fanny, Longfellow, was well educated, but she never, went to a traditional school, but she had the best tutors in the Boston area, right?
Well, Fanny Frances Elizabeth Appleton Longfellow. And we should tell the people that are here tonight that the title of the book, Cross of Snow, refers to a poem that Longfellow wrote 18 years after the horrific death of Fanny in an accident that we can talk about or not as we go on. But it was a horrific loss. And on the 18th anniversary of her death, they'd been married 18 years, one night, and that was actually the 18th anniversary of her death. He wrote this sonnet, this 14-line poem, in which he compared her loss to the sight of the burden of grief that he was carrying on his chest. He compared to the side of a mountain that had the figure of a cross. And so I wanted in some way, I mentioned this because, yes, it is, as the subtitle says, a life of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. It really is, by design, mindfully, a dual biography of Henry and this woman who was not only the great love of his life, the mother of his children, but also his intellectual partner in every conceivable way that you can think. And this came at a time when women were not formally educated. It just was the overwhelming prerogative of men. Now, in listening to your wonderful overview there, Barbara, I noted that we're talking about the very same period of time. Your Fanny was born in 1802. Henry Longfellow was born in 1807. Fanny Appleton in 1817. Your book, 1854, is the same year as Evangeline is published. So we're kind of moving along, and not necessarily parallel tracks, but companion tracks, because Henry Longfellow is enormously popular. And I love the dust jacket of this book. We have it. Barbara has it over her shoulder, and I have it over my shoulder here, but there it is. What I love about this jacket and this photograph is that it was taken in 1868. So this is a number of years after the death of Fanny, and it was during his triumphant tour of Europe. And it was really a few days after he was received by Queen Victoria in Windsor Castle. And the Queen that night wrote in her journal how amazed she was at all the domestic staff, not just the people of a certain class, how they were all taking vantage points and trying to get a look at this poet who they all knew. Everyone read his works, and it was Alfred Lord Tennyson, the poet laureate of England, who was really bragging about how much money he made. He says, I make £3,000 a year, and he's a poet laureate. In England, he said, but Longfellow makes 5,000. He outsold the great poets of England on their own turf. This is how enormously popular he was, translated into 30 languages. And then he got lost. He got rejected in the 20th century. And one of the reasons I wanted to write this book was kind of, number one, I thought he had been unfairly cast out of the literary canon. So in a way, you're rediscovering somebody. I'm hoping to refocus on somebody. It's not like Longfellow needs to be rediscovered, because everybody knows who he is. But the major component here, what made my book really interesting and special for me to want to do it, was the opportunity to write about Fanny. Because as important as she was this remarkable muse, it was a symbiotic relationship. She was his true intellectual partner in every way that you can imagine. And I really moved heaven and earth to document this. It wasn't the easiest thing to document. Spent 8 years on this, as you know, going to the Longfellow House in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is a National Park Service historic site, and the Wadsworth Longfellow House up in Portland, Maine. So here's one American writer that has 2 historic sites of his former homes. I can't think of any other writer that can say that. And each one of these is filled with artifacts, objects that are authentic, and documents, 800,000 or so documents. So I was really able to try and look at not only the objects that helped define their lives, but the documents, and really get a look at this remarkable woman who, as you say, was not formally educated. But one thing she did have, she was a young woman of wealth. There's no two ways about it. Her father was a Beacon Hill power. He was an industrialist, a manufacturer. He had founded the city of Lowell, Massachusetts, the first great industrial textile city in North America, and a man of enormous wealth. And if you were a person of enormous wealth and you had daughters and you wanted them educated, and you had the means, then you were also able to hire private tutors for them. So Fanny, I mean, you talk about the irony of it. Women in general were not really able to get the kinds of education that men were. But on the other hand, if you could afford it, you had a list. She was taught by Elizabeth Palmer Peabody, George Barrow Emerson, William Russell. She learned art instruction from Francis Grader, who was the great German art instructor. Dance from Lorenzo Papanti, who introduced the waltz to America. I mean, you can go on. And she embraced it. You know, when she wanted to learn Dante in the original, the Commedia, she hired an Italian professor at Harvard, you know, who was hired by Henry Longfellow's predecessor. And so when Henry Longfellow, he had a first wife who died tragically by a miscarriage, and that devastated him. And when he met this young woman, they were 9-10 years apart, he was absolutely swept off his feet. And it wasn't just because she was such a striking, impressive young woman, with multi-talented, multilingual, 6 languages she spoke. Henry spoke 15. We haven't even got to the translation. Henry Longfellow, yes, we know him as the great poet. But long before he was this internationally renowned poet, he began as a person, an 18-year-old graduate of Bowdoin College up in Brunswick, Maine. On graduation day in 1825, he was offered a full professorship, 18-year-old kid, to teach modern European languages at Bowdoin. This would be the 4th such college in the United States that did this, provided he goes to Europe and learns these languages. So for the next 3.5 years, he's in Europe learning French. He's living in France, Italian, Spanish. He comes back with 6 languages, and 10 years later, he goes back as he gets ready to accept an appointment at Harvard. When he meets Fanny Appleton, he learns a half a dozen more. But translation is central. He introduced 25 German writers to American readers, Goethe and Schiller among them. He's the first American to do a full translation of Dante into English. So we have this kind of parallel dynamic, I think, you and I, between these two characters. But Fanny is essential. And one thing and Longfellow was brilliant. There's no two ways about it. He's a great poet. He wrote in any number of different poetic forms, 420 or so published poems in his lifetime, quite a few others left in his archives, many of them classics of their form. But it was just he was a man of remarkable popularity, and Fanny Longfellow was a woman who inspired him. And I think what he wanted more than anything else was a woman that he could relate to intellectually, who was his equal, and she was all of that. And I think I demonstrate that in the book. So that's a long answer to your question about the education of women. And but what he was looking for, people say, oh, he married this very wealthy woman. Her father bought them this magnificent house, which it is. The old colonial mansion was a wedding present from her father. No, what he really was looking for was an intellectual partner, which is what she was. And of course, she was the great love of his life. But it's
which is fully documented in the journals and the letters that you had access to.
Yeah, well, one of the great things, I love to hear people's voices. I love to quote. If I taught you anything as a writer, I think it's let people talk. Right. Let's hear their voices. Let's hear what they have to say. And one of the great beauties of researching this book is the extraordinary body of correspondence that they left behind. I mean, Fanny wrote these marvelous letters. 812 of her letters are in Longfellow House. Longfellow wrote 10,000 or so letters, which are the best of which have been gathered in a 6-volume edition. And when I was able also to see the letters that Longfellow that were written to him, and also letters that were written to Fanny, they're all at the Harvard Library, the Houghton Library. So not only was I able to get their voices, and because they're such beautiful writers, I mean, you don't have to really paraphrase them at all. You just let them speak. You hear them speak. You hear their voices, and that was just a wonderful experience to be able to write about these people in the 19th century who are no longer with us. So you're not going to get any complaints, from living people, as I've had in my life as a journalist. I mean, you go out and you're in there and you're writing about living people, and you expect to have some pushback every once in a while, and but here you're dealing with people who have left a wonderful body of correspondence and journals to document themselves. But it was really great fun. Yeah. As you know, you lived through a lot of it while I was doing it.
I remember when you were writing the end of Fanny.
I couldn't do it. Oh yeah. Well, I mean, this is the first book I've written, if I may, in process. It's the 10th book. But as a writer, as a nonfiction writer, I've generally worked in parallel. I mean, I start a chapter and I work on it for a while, a couple months, and I'm constantly I'm a journalist at heart. I really gather information and material. And if I become energized on something, I'll work on that, I'll work on that, and I'll work on that. And if the book goes kind of the way I hope, everything comes together at the end. You have all these converging chapters. But the Longfellow book, it was entirely different. This is the first book and my first biography where it really was linear. It was chapter 2 followed chapter 1, chapter 3 followed chapter 2. And I thought that the demise of Fanny would come, 6, 7, or it was really chapter 16 where I finally had to deal with her in an 18 chapter book. It was devastating because by then I felt I really knew them, and I knew what was coming, and there's no way you can alter what's happening. Should we mention for the audience what happens? I mean, because it's a very 19th century story, and it's almost Victorian, in the conceit that they wore these big hooped crinoline dresses, number one, and then Fanny it was a hot summer day in July. And she had several young daughters, and she was trimming hair with golden hair from her daughter Edith to seal in little envelopes with wax. And somehow only the little girls were witness to this. A drop of molten wax fell on her dress. She burst into flames. She ran shrieking. This was to the study where her husband was taking a nap. He attempted futilely to put out the flames. He did, with a throw rug finally, but it was too late. She died the following morning. And that's why, by the way, he grows this beard that we all know him. Prior to this day in his life, he was a very handsome, dapper guy, clothes horse, really very clean shaven. And then he never shaves again. He covers up these facial scars. But it's a horrific loss. And which is one of the reasons why he returned to translation, by the way. He had done all these translations when he was a young professor. When he came back from Europe on his first trip, 22-year-old professor at Bowdoin, there were no textbooks to teach his students in Spanish, Italian, French. So he he published 9 textbooks in a period of 7 years. And you can still find them out there because there were no textbooks that he could use for his students. But then he said, when I am unable to do anything original, which is original poetry, I turn to translation. And it was then that he returned to the translation of Dante, which turns out to be really the great. I mean, we just had a seminar last week with Harvard University. I spoke at it. It was the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And I did a little panel on Fanny, Longfellow, and Henry's translation, and how really today it is still regarded as one of the great translations into English, because Longfellow really believed in fidelity to the original. And he said, a person doesn't read Dante to see what I see my version of Dante. They want to see what an Englishman might read if he could read Dante in the original. He had a very clear, and I wonder, you must have a theory of translation, Barbara, because to read your translation, I have to say, this is not your father talking. I mean, it's so smooth. It's so wonderful. It could very well be written in English. This could almost be the design. It's not clunky. It's smooth. You just have a sense of nuance and rhythm and choice of words. And I guess it's fidelity to the original on the one hand, but making it accessible to a 21st century reader. I think these are some of the things that, a translator feels it's incumbent to do. And maybe you could comment a little bit on that.
Well, I mean, part of it, as you said, at least with Dante and Longfellow's working with a great, right? He's working with Dante. He's already working from something that's extraordinary, which it helps. With Fanny Reybaud, it was similar. I mean, she's not well known. I really hope that, again, people will discover her, but her writing here, it is, after having read some of her other materials, she's on, right? She's finally figured out how to get a story going, how to introduce characters, how to describe them with an economy of words yet that are still engaging. You're not left trying to figure out what's going on. So she does all of that work in the original, which is great. And she uses words that we would recognize today, which we do recognize. Again, like you said, the trick is to make it accessible for somebody today. And one thing I did notice, I did read some of the earlier translations, and they are respective of their moments in time, as I'm sure this one is as well, having been published in 2020. If another translation were to come along, as you see often with various pieces of world classics, each generation will change things a little bit to meet the needs of the audience. But those earlier translations were Victorian. There's a lot of passive sentence structure. The action is gone, or the sort of racy scenes are smoothed over, and you're kind of left wondering, well, why did this happen? Because there's a big piece that's been left out, which, if it were there, would explain a lot of. There's actually a murder in this book. I'm going to give it away. But you don't really understand why that happens if you don't understand the lead up to it. And in some of those earlier translations, it's missing. Or the translations were the translator, for example, there were a couple instances where the word remained in French. And if you're an English reader, you're not going to know, you're reading it in English because you don't know French, which I thought was a disservice. I can think off the top of my head, there was one word in the 1905 translation, it was a diligence. And the translator didn't know what it was, so he left it in English. And in English, I'm just going to guess, nobody knows what a diligence is. I don't believe it's a word in English. And in fact, it is a wheeled wagon it's like a taxi, except it's got somebody in front rather than an animal. So that was one example in this translation that I thought was important. Now, I don't think Longfellow did this, but in this translation, I did include endnotes because I operated under the assumption that readers would not be familiar with the literary references that Fanny was making. For example, some of the books that the main character reads were banned. They were banned books. They're banned by the church. So names like Rousseau, we know Rousseau, but we don't maybe necessarily know which books of his were banned. So I provided endnotes to give some context. Otherwise, I think it would go over the head of a lot of readers. And I think readers would miss out a lot on why those particular books are being mentioned in this text, or why the main character is reading them. So
actually, if I may, one of the great highlights of Longfellow's translation of Dante is this extraordinary body of notes. It's just remarkable, and there was a modern library edition of the Inferno. Matthew Pearl, who did the Dante Club, did it. And one of the reasons was not only to get that translation of the Inferno, but to publish the notes, which are remarkable, because it's not just what he's thinking and translating this particular line, but he is a scholar, and he will give you the historical resonances of what's going on. Another thing he did also, because even though he did not regard it as original work, because he's translating Dante, something he did, which is quite special, and which I write about in the book, for each of the three parts of, for each of the three parts of Dante, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, he wrote 2 sonnets, promes they call them, as kind of introductory sonnets to introduce. So 6 sonnets, 2 to introduce each of the 3 parts, and they're quite original and quite beautiful. And I really believe, by the way, just to throw this out, that there is no better writer of sonnets, no better American writer of sonnets in the English language, bar none, without any qualification, than Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Name me one. I'd be delighted to hear, who you might nominate. You go to English, okay, we got Shakespeare, we got Shelley, we got Keats, we have others, beautiful sonneteers. But Longfellow's sonnets, and he only did about 43 or 45 of them, and he really began doing them towards the end of his life. And it's 14 perfect lines of iambic pentameter. But it's classic. It goes back to Petrarch, goes back hundreds of years, and the form really hasn't changed. And he really just wrote these magnificent little sonnets. And that's
but he could hear it in the original, and he knew how to make, because it's not, you're taking a structure that's not meant for English, right?
Well,
that is not meant with the language.
Yeah, except that, the English sonneteers did make it their own. I mean, you go back to the Earl of Surrey and Shakespeare, all of those the sonnets, 146 sonnets there, which are beautiful. It's ideally suited for Italian, of course, Petrarch and Santa, because so many words can rhyme. And when Longfellow translated Dante, he was very respectful of the original terza rima, without getting into the structure, the tercet lines, which is kind of like a chain rhyming scheme. Well, he couldn't really do that. It would have been foolish. He could have done it, but it would have been foolish to have, A, B, C. And it goes throughout the poem, where this word is rhyming with the one that 2 lines before it, and this one goes all the way through. So he didn't really follow the rhyming scheme, but he followed the measure. And he was very faithful to giving as literal a translation as he could, while retaining the poetic structure, which is another reason why people such as Harold Bloom, who I interviewed for my book, regards Longfellow's translation of Dante as the best. And we're talking about Harold Bloom here, who's the late Harold Bloom, was a great literary critic and writer of the book The Western Canon. So anyway.
Well, I know Giovanna had a little note in the chat that she wanted to open it up.
Oh, yeah. Well, good. I think it's a good time for that. Sure. Absolutely.
Should we
Well,
do
it's
that?
completely up to you. It's completely.
Well, if there are some questions, we'd love
Yes.
to have them.
Yes, so please, if you'd like to ask a question, you can type it in the chat box, or you're welcome to unmute.
Okay.
It's a quiet group tonight.
Well, while we're waiting for questions, one thing I wanted to ask was, Dad, you mentioned Longfellow. It is a name that people recognize. It's Longfellow the poet, but there has been a period of time where he hasn't been read, or he has not been studied.
Well, yeah,
This
that's a
book is in a
whole.
way, perhaps
I deal with this. I touch on it in the book. I didn't really want to make that one of the driving issues of the book. I really wanted to tell the life, examine the life, and really tell the story of his wife and their relationship. But in the beginning, I do say one of the reasons I thought that a new look at Longfellow was an honor is there hadn't really been a major biography of Longfellow, and pick a number, 45 years or so. There have been other books. I don't want to say there haven't been. There have been a couple of others, not necessarily full biographical treatments, but he has had some people look at it. But for the most part, in the 20th century, he was kicked out of the canon, mindfully by the modernists who were rejecting, 19th century values. And let's say it, old New England poets, fireside poets of a certain caste. I mean, a guy with a big white beard writing, kind of folksy poems, maybe just didn't appeal to the development of the modernist point of view of the 20th century, and he was rejected. And so people continued to love his poetry. To say he wasn't read, I know it took the Library of America, which I love. I mean, which has been around since 1984, and they've been publishing the landmarks of American literature. It took them finally to 101 volumes before they decided to do Longfellow. And I got the numbers. I have the numbers, and it's the 101st in a series of about 220, 101, that's funny, 230 authors, but he's about the 10th or 11th bestseller. So and he came late, or Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, because they've done their writings. So they do, and Poe, of course, is a hugely popular, but Longfellow holds his own. And I hear from so many people of a certain age who say, "Oh, thank you for writing this book. I remember being required to memorize this poem, Psalm of Life, that poem in school, and remember it very fondly." And there are so many people that really engaged with Longfellow. I maintain, again, I offer this, prove me wrong, but I think that Paul Revere's Ride is by far the most memorized poem ever written by an American. I mean, name me another poem that has been memorized more frequently than "Listen, My Children, and You Shall Hear of the Midnight Ride" of Paul Revere. I don't think there are. Everybody memorized. I mean, you did. You came along a little later, but
a little later.
Another thing you say weren't read. Part of it was okay. So it wasn't just because people lost interest in him, but when you are no longer included in the anthologies, when powers that be decide that you're not relevant and that you're not suitable to be read in the classroom, well, students aren't going to really read you, are they, if they can't find you in the anthologies? And one thing we have found in recent years is that Longfellow is coming back and he is being read. And one of the things I write about is that there is kind of a renaissance of interest. I mean, he's never going to be the most popular poet in the history, and which he was, by the way. He was a true celebrity of his time. I mean, he was arguably even our first rock star. I mean, it's a whole other consideration. And I say, don't scoff at that. Just read the book. I mean, just see how thoroughly and how profoundly he permeated, American life around the world. People flocked to his house. It was the most visited house in North America. They'd knock on his door. He would answer. He'd dispense cards with his signature on it. It was an amazing dynamic. Well, there's no way you could sustain that throughout the 20th century, but he's too good a poet to be dismissed entirely. And I'm not really leading the crusade or the charge. I say, give him a shot. Read about his life. Give his poems. You can find them. Do a Google. They're all there. They're all public access, and read some of them. Read them aloud. They're beautiful. They really are musical.
They're beautiful aloud. And after reading the biography and seeing knowing that he was really he loved his women.
He did.
You get to see, I would say, the inspiration for some of these works. It comes from his life, which
absolutely, without question. Yeah.
And it gives it a lot more nuance and context.
Yeah.
Knowing, I mean, you think of him as the bearded old white guy, but he was Enrico at one point.
Well, when he was, he did these self-portraits, and I have a number of them in the book. A very talented artist, by the way. Sketches, and I photographed every page of his journals kept throughout his life, hundreds of pages at the Houghton Library. And I did all of the transcriptions of his diaries on my own, because the first transcription of his diary was done by a reverential brother who was a minister, and basically bowdlerized, all of the really good stuff out of it. And not that there's anything racy in there, but he's a little more frank. I mean, he did have a nervous breakdown. One thing I had a nervous breakdown, but he was really very deeply depressed. Because one thing we haven't discussed is that he wooed Fanny for 7 years, that he met her and then he came back to Boston and he tried, and it took him 7 years. It took her 7 years to decide that, okay, and there's always been a mystery what took her so long. And I think I have answers for that we don't have time to discuss, but she was really also looking for an intellectual partner, I think. And he also wrote a novel, which was a big mistake, a roman à clé, a French expression, about his failed attempts to win her hand. And so there were a lot of complications, but so it was a love story, wasn't it? It's
a love story
as much as anything else.
Giovanna posted a question about Fanny Reybaud, about being forgotten, why she was forgotten. I mean, Longfellow fell out of favor or was cast out, right? And Fanny Reybaud was the opposite. She was not cast out. She was, she was adored, and not just as a person, but her works. Once she hit her stride, really, with her previous book and then Mademoiselle de Malpeire, people wanted her books. I mean, you could say she was writing for the masses, and yet there's a lot in there that is literary, that is highbrow, that has been researched. So she had something for everybody, and she was translated and well received in her translations. What I suspect, again, because there's so little, I'm kind of working from the polar opposite of my dad. He's got 2 houses full of material to work with, and to tell you that I have 50 pages in this journal that was published in 1924, a biography written by a friend of the family's attorney, almost 60 years after her death. That's the primary document I have to work with on her life. You have to sort of fill in the blanks and infer what happened. Part of the issue was her family had predeceased her, or they had left, or they just didn't value the materials that she left, which is possible. There's about 100 documents written in her hand or written to her that are in a museum in Aix-en-Provence, which I just received a week or 2 ago in PDF format, which is very exciting because there's material there that's in her hand that talks about, or that she is writing. She's writing notes to her editor, or she's asking for money, or these sorts of things, which gives a little bit of a glimpse into her life. But this is all that's left. And we know, for example, that she kept a daily journal throughout her life. Where that went, I have no idea. And her literary champions also, they died around the same time she did. So once they were gone, as Dad mentioned, tastes change. People are looking at different types of literature. This particular style gets sort of taken over by folks like Zola, who are more journalistic. She just sort of, it's kind of,
I'm going to have to
remembered
check.
And who isn't.
I'm going to have to check, because there are still 12,000 books in the Longfellow house. Their books, their original libraries there. And Fanny and the great event every day of their married life, without fail, was they got together and they read to each other. And they read an astonishing variety of books. And most of them are still there. And as I said, Fanny had 6 languages. Henry had 15. The books in their library are in 45 dialects, at least 15 languages, and they read them to each other. They were brilliant. Now, among these books, there are a dozen George Sand. They were big fans of George Sand.
Fans of George Sand. Oh my!
Yeah. But I don't. I'm going to check. There's no catalog, but my friends are the archivists, and they'll check for me. I'd be curious to see if
what they read.
If your gal is in there, she could very well be.
If you read the 2 of them, if you're at all interested in reading French literature from this period, and you do read something by George Sand, maybe Leila, which also has a French, a female protagonist. And you read that next to Fanny, Mademoiselle de Malepeire. Their styles are so different. What they're emphasizing is different. You might need a dictionary in French to understand some of the words that George Sand is writing about in French. So totally different, yet writing at the same time. They actually both wrote for the same literary magazine at the same time. It's possible that George Sand considered Fanny Reybaud a literary rival, seeing as they were two of maybe three women writing at that moment in time. It's not clear. There's no existing correspondence. And George Sand wrote a lot, and a lot of her letters have been published. There's no mention, at least as I found, of Fanny Reybaud in her existing correspondence. Nothing, obviously, that I found on Fanny's side to suggest that they knew each other. But interestingly, once Fanny Reybaud started writing for this literary magazine, George Sand left.
No kidding.
What does that mean? I don't know.
Interesting.
Interesting, but there's not much else there, which is so tantalizing because.
So Barbara, a friend of mine who I won't name, but you know who I'm talking about, because it's a private communication, but a person who's done a lot of scholarly things, absolutely loved your book, and really said, I hope Barbara does more translation of this. She has made a magnificent discovery here, and wonders if you plan on doing any more of her books.
Well, I think it depends whether folks like this first one.
Well, everything takes time, and it's been a tough year. I mean, the pandemic
2020 was there were other things, more pressing issues.
We all get a mulligan on this one, I think. In terms of the approbation that we might otherwise have been able to generate out there, but it certainly shouldn't discourage us from moving on. No. And I think you've really kind of found something here, and I'm not the only one who believes this. So I'm not just a proud father urging you to do more on this along these lines, because I think it's a very valuable service that you've done, and it's wonderful.
Thank you. That's lovely. I have a couple to answer your question. I have a couple ideas in mind for which one would come next, but you also have to find them. They're not that easy to find in French. They're not really in print. You got to find them on the secondary market. So that in itself is a bit of a hunt, but we shall see.
Right. So these are not on Project Gutenberg in French or otherwise, right? So
no. It's to hunt down anything relating to Fanny Reybaud. It takes a while, and to find booksellers who might have something. Sometimes they think they do, but it's by somebody else. She didn't actually publish under Fanny Reybaud. Her first books were under a pseudonym, which was her mother's, I think, grandmother's maiden name, something like that. And then she published under her husband's name. So she's just, in terms of finding material that she's written, is challenging. And you have to kind of know what name she wrote under when.
Right. So we'd have to know her pseudonyms to really know.
Yeah, and
what
most of them are known. Most of them are known. It's just keeping everything in order. When did she write under her grandmother's maiden name? When was she using her husband's name? When was she mixing the two? Even for this book, if you look for it on Google or you do any kind of search, it comes up as Madame Charles Reybaud. It was not Fanny Reybaud. That was a convention at the time. It also offered her a little bit of protection to suggest that, she's still married, she's in a stable relationship, she's not this woman writer, God forbid. She actually there's one piece of existing letter that she wrote to a friend where she actually talks about her disdain for women who would just, why would they ever want to publish books? It's beneath them. There are better things for them to do. And here she is, she turns her, it could be cover for what she's about to attempt, which is to go publish and become an author. Or it could just represent that there are these two very powerful elements in the early and mid 1800s affecting women and what they can do with their lives.
Right.
It's a long way.
So do you think there are any unpublished manuscripts of hers out there in Bibliothèque Nationale or something like that?
Are there any unpublished?
Do you think there are any unpublished manuscripts of hers out there to be found?
Oh, I don't think, if there was anything, it disappeared in between World War I and World War II, because the house, her mother's country house in Aix-en-Provence was, I believe, sold, and it might have suffered damage from the inconvenience. So anything that was there is likely obliterated at this point.
Oh.
But you never know. It's worth the
Never
trip,
know.
right?
Yeah, well, it's good research trip to the BN, you know.
Right. But I mean, if I would imagine you'd have to actually go there and look in their catalogs because I've looked.
Well, that's what's wrong with that. That's fun.
No, that would be a lot of fun. Field trip.
Well, this is fun.
This was fun, Giovanna. I don't know how you're doing on time, but
Well,
we're
it's
talking about this, so-
7:57 and we have time for another question if anyone has any questions. I mean, also, I was just curious myself how you chose to become a translator. I mean, that's what was your training for that, aside from your knowledge of the language of French, for instance?
I didn't go to translating school. I've loved French since I was fortunate enough to actually start learning it in kindergarten. Go figure. This project was really my first long form translation. I'd done some for Dad. I'd done some for the NEH, also 19th century materials, which was far more challenging because you're actually reading their handwriting, which is just, that's another layer of complexity. I know my daughter, when she reads my cursive, she thinks it's from another era. I suppose it's true for every generation, but cursive from the 19th century is just, if you've read it, it's really a challenge. The challenge really was internal. First was to see if I could do it. And then when I saw I could do it and do it with a certain fidelity to the original text and to see how it really, people who read it really seem to find something different in it, which is great, which is rewarding in itself. But it's all kind of a long way to, I guess, to answer your question that I didn't set out thinking I would become a translator. But it is an element, I think, of teaching. Dad mentioned Longfellow published works, but using original text. You see so many textbooks today where it's dry, where you're just looking at grammar, you're looking at vocabulary, and why would you want to learn that? There's nothing living there. So I suppose I would hope that people who are learning about French literature, or learning about this era in French history, would pick this up and learn something new from it.
Let's not forget the fact that you spent a year at the Sorbonne in Paris.
Yeah,
and that I think
That
might have
helped.
had.
I did get to live in Aix, actually, where Fanny was born.
So I mean, there are a lot of factors at play that not only
Yeah.
translation something you enjoy, but you love the language and you love the culture and a lot of these things.
If you've ever been
all
to
work
Aix-en-Provence, or you have an image in your head of France, it's the lavender fields, it's Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire, it's that area of France, and if you do happen to read Mademoiselle de Malepeire, it is described where you feel you're breathing in the pine trees and the little flowers that grow in the bushes. I will say it's a little bit of a tangent, but Fanny is excellent at describing scenery. You could say she's an amateur botanist, which is not unusual, I think, for women in this era. One of her books, she describes the Caribbean, and she never went. She actually never visited the Caribbean, but scholars who have read her descriptions of these flowers and plants and shells, you would assume that she had been there and she had studied it. So an intense appreciation for the flora and fauna of her surroundings is noticeable.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us, and from two different locations, Westchester and Boston. This is great. This is one of the best parts about having our virtual programs, is that we can welcome both of you
Thank you.
in the same room, so to speak. So thank you so much for that.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. This has been a lot of fun.
Barbara, we'll have to do this
It was
again.
a lot of fun.